In December 2019, the Institute of Public Affairs published this video on YouTube, but it missed several important details. The video that follows aims to fill in those gaps.
I wasn't told that since the 1950s, polar bear numbers have increased by around 400%.
So the first question is, how did you get this number? Here's what I think. You took the number of polar bears today, subtracted how many there were in the past, and then converted that into a percentage. Now we know how many polar bears there are today. It's about 26,000, and that's a number that's backed by a reputable source. Now, some people think that the number of polar bears in the 1950s was 5,000, and this would explain how some people get a 400% increase in polar bears since the 1950s. But here's the problem. There isn't enough reliable evidence for this figure. That hasn't stopped it from spreading, though. Bjorn Lomborg said it in his book, and he cites this article in the New York Times. The author of the article, however, doesn't know where the number came from, and he only says, "I thought that this figure was widely accepted." Patrick Moore has tweeted the idea of a 400% increase in polar bear numbers, again without a source. A senator from Alaska said something similar, a 300% increase. Again, no source. So the bottom line is I just can't trust this number because there's no reliable evidence for it. Now here's another problem. Even if there has been an increase in the number of polar bears over the years, how can you be sure that it wasn't because of laws that were put in place in the 1970s to protect polar bears? How can you be sure that it wasn't the efforts of polar nations to stop illegal hunting? In other words, how can you be sure that global warming didn't have any impact whatsoever on polar bear numbers at all? The answer is we can't.
I wasn't told water vapor is in fact the most abundant greenhouse gas.
Okay, being abundant doesn't mean more important. Despite its abundance, water vapor doesn't drive global warming, and here's why. First, the amount of water vapor depends on temperature, not the other way around. In other words, water vapor can act as an amplifier of global warming, but not as a primary driver of it. Second, water vapor doesn't last in the atmosphere for long enough to affect the change in temperature that we've seen over the last few decades. Now this is because water vapor can easily condense into clouds and fall as rain. CO2, on the other hand, stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years because it relies on really slow processes like chemical weathering and tectonic activity in order to be taken out of the atmosphere.
That CO2 only makes up 0.04% of the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay, but so what? Small amounts of things can have big effects. I mean, if you ingest a few grains of crystallized ricin, you would die. Consider this, an 80 part per million increase of CO2 helped bring the Earth out of an ice age during the Pleistocene epoch. And how about this? A 2000 part per million drop in CO2 plunged the Earth into a severe ice age during the late Ordovician period.
And only a fraction of that 0.04% is caused by humans.
Nearly all of the CO2 in the atmosphere currently is from human emissions. What you're missing is the fact that so-called natural sources have natural sinks, so there's roughly net zero emissions from natural processes. In other words, there aren't really any natural sources of CO2. But human sources don't have decent sinks at the moment, so it accumulates. And we've accumulated about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 since the 1750s, or the start of the Industrial Revolution. And there's more. The CO2 emitted from burning of fossil fuels is based on one type of carbon called carbon-12. So, as we burn fossil fuels, the amount of carbon-12 in the atmosphere increases, while the concentration of the other types of carbon, carbon-13 and 14, don't change much. So, when scientists looked at the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, they found a decrease since the 1800s, which coincides really well since the start of the Industrial Revolution.
And I wasn't told there have been multiple times in the Earth's history where CO2 levels have been higher and temperature has been lower.
You're probably missing the fact that the sun was also weaker during those times. But here's what's interesting. Even during the times when CO2 was higher and temperatures were lower, when CO2 dropped by about 2000 parts per million, the Earth plunged into a severe ice age. So even during those times, CO2 was still a primary factor in the regulation of global temperatures.
I was told that 97% of scientists agree that human-induced climate change is happening and that the science is settled. But I wasn't told that there is no scientific consensus on the issue of climate change.
The scientific community doesn't achieve consensus by agreeing with each other. Rather, consensus is achieved when scientists can no longer disagree.
Now, this is partly because the scientific method itself is predicated on trying to disprove your own ideas and the ideas of others, and getting other scientists to do the same. When scientists achieve consensus on some theory, it's not because they like each other or they like the theory. It's because the evidence itself forces scientists to accept the theory, because they've tried their best to destroy it and failed. So when Naomi Oreskes looked at 900 papers on climate change, she found none of them disputed that recent global warming is due to burning of fossil fuels. When John Cook and his colleagues looked at about 11,000 papers, he found that 97% agreed that global warming is due to burning of fossil fuels. Remember that scientists build careers on disagreeing with each other, so it's a big deal that 97% or even 80 or 90% of published papers cannot disagree that the recent global warming is due to burning of fossil fuels.
Science is never really settled.
Technically correct, but contextually wrong. Science isn't settled at the bleeding edge of the unknown, but scientists aren't arguing about established science. If they did, the government would be asking them, what the hell are you doing wasting our money on running the same experiment in exactly the same way to tell us the same things that we already know about things that you've already established?
In September, a global network of 500 scientists submitted a letter to the United Nations, stressing that there is no climate emergency, and their letter contained a lot of other things that I was never told.
Of those signatories, 40% were engineers and geologists, with no expertise in climate change. Only 2.8% were actively publishing climate scientists. Business executives, politicians, lobbyists, and other non-scientists cumulatively ranked higher in number than climate scientists, about 12%. The rest of the signatures were physicists, chemists, mathematicians, and so on, again with no expertise in climate change.
As Galileo said, in questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual.
The key word in Galileo's quote is reasoning, not individual. Just because an idea is held by an individual doesn't mean it's right. So here's a quote that I've come up with. In questions of science, the authority of millions of data points of evidence collected by scientists aiming to disprove the current theories of climate change, but failing to do so, is worth more than any poorly informed videos by policy think tanks.
Global warming has not increased natural disasters.
Let's go through the list of predictions. Climate science predicted
An increased proportion of cyclones reaching higher intensity categories.
Climate science predicted more extreme rainfall events. Climate science predicted more flooding events as a result of those extreme rainfall events.
Climate science predicted an increased risk of wildfires.
And finally,
Climate science also predicted an increased occurrence of heat waves.
I wasn't told Physics Nobel Prize winner Ivar Giva thinks climate change is a pseudoscience.
an expert in one field of science isn't necessarily an expert in every other field. But of course, if Dr. Giva has some important revelations to share about climate science, why not publish it in a peer-reviewed, reputable journal and allow all the other experts to respond?
I was told we will reach a tipping point in 11 years, the point of no return, that our world, at least the world as we know it, will end.
I'm guessing you got this from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she misinterpreted this IPCC report. But the report itself said we have 11 years to stop the Earth from going above 1.5 degrees centigrade, not that the Earth was ending. My advice is don't get your science from politicians. You should ask the relevant scientists or read the papers yourself and ask thorough questions if you don't understand something.
In 2006, in the film An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore said that humanity had only 10 years left before the world would reach the point of no return.
Again, don't get your science from politicians and movies made by politicians.
In the 1970s, there was scientific consensus that the Earth was heading into a period of significant cooling or a possible ice age.
In the 1970s, only 7 papers predicted cooling while 44 predicted warming. And as years went by, more evidence came in and it was clear that warming was going to dominate and more papers predicted warming. The scientific consensus quickly became that global warming would dominate. But the popular media at the time, like the New York Times and the National Geographic and so on, they ran with the global cooling story. And people like Ben Shapiro and Senator Inhofe still believe this myth to this day. So while the media and the politicians may have made up their minds that scientists predicted global cooling, the scientists themselves actually predicted global warming back in the 1970s.
In 2009, Prince Charles said we had 8 years to save the world from irretrievable climate and ecosystem collapse.
Again, don't rely on politicians for an accurate report on climate science.
I also wasn't told about the one factor that all these predictions failed to account for: human ingenuity and creativity.
Our ingenuity also made solar panels, the wind turbine, the hydroelectric dam, nuclear power, and hopefully one day nuclear fusion as well. So I'm really puzzled as to why some people want to ignore that ingenuity. Consider this. With coal, you have to mine, process it, transport it, burn it, and then transport the energy to consumers and do that over again and again and again and again for as long as you want electricity. But with solar panels, you mine the materials, you process them, transport them, then you make the panels, and then consumers and businesses can buy them, and they sit there for 25 to 30 years generating power. With coal, you must construct and maintain large-scale energy infrastructure to transport the power. With solar, you can also allow consumers to install the panels right where they need them, therefore reducing the need for energy transfer infrastructure. With coal, you're completely reliant on centralized governments and corporations to supply your energy. But with solar, you have your own mini power plant on your roof. Consider this as well. For poorer nations, especially rural villages in poor nations, fossil fuels are too expensive because they have to be imported. Solar panels and solar-powered pumps and ovens, on the other hand, are comparatively cheaper because people don't need to constantly buy fossil fuels. Plus the devices are low maintenance and they rarely break down. So human ingenuity certainly is trying to solve the problem of climate change, but we aren't going to get anywhere if people keep trying to avoid the problem itself.
Since 1990, 1.2 billion people have overcome extreme poverty. That means 137,000 people have been lifted out of poverty every day for 25 years. It has never been a better time to be alive.
Just because things are great now doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make them better. And just because things are great now doesn't mean there aren't problems that we need to solve. Climate change is just another problem that needs to be solved.
So rather than worrying about the world ending in 50 years, or 11 years, or was it 18 months?
I'm not worried, but I'm not complacent either. And I do enjoy life when I can, but that doesn't mean I'm just gonna stick my head in the sand and avoid any responsibilities that I might have. Climate change is a problem. We just have to get on with the job of actually solving it, and that's it. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to know more about what else you weren't told about climate change, please see the more detailed version of this video. And if you really want to know much more about climate change, please watch Potholer 54's playlist, Debunking the Myths and Clarifying the Science.